What happens when a simple stop at a gas station turns into a life-changing encounter? What if a moment of racial profiling is interrupted by unexpected power? Can one man's calm defiance shift the course of an entire situation? Watch as Michael Davis confronts a racist cop, only to reveal the truth that changes everything. Will Officer Thompson learn the hard way? Stay tuned to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell on H2 Black Thread. It was well past midnight when Michael Davis, a black man in his early 30s, pulled his sleek black sports car onto the forecourt of a nearly deserted gas station on the outskirts of Detroit. The city, known for its bustling streets during the day, had fallen silent under the weight of the night. The once vibrant neighborhood now stood in quiet repose, its neon lights flickering against the dark sky. Michael had grown used to these long drives, these stretches of road that seemed to go on forever, offering him solitude and space to think. He wasn't in a rush. He was just letting the wheels carry him, feeling the hum of the engine beneath him as he made his way through the quiet highways. The car, a deep, polished black with chrome accents, gleamed under the dim lights of the gas station, looking almost out of place against the backdrop of an aging, run-down neighborhood. The headlights cut through the still night, casting long shadows across the pavement as he slowed to a stop. He reached for the fuel nozzle, taking a moment to stretch his shoulders before stepping out of the car. The gas station, tucked away on a lonely corner, was the kind of place that never quite saw much traffic. A few scattered vehicles sat in the dim light of the gas pumps, and the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting uneven pools of light on the cracked pavement. It wasn't the kind of place one would expect to see someone like Michael, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit with sharp, tailored lines, polished leather shoes, and a silk tie that caught the light as he moved. But for Michael, it didn't matter where he was. It was just a stop, one of many on his late-night drive. A quick refuel, a moment to clear his head. As the pump clicked, signaling that his car was full, Michael ran a hand through his neatly styled hair and exhaled a slow breath, relieved to stretch out after the long hours on the road. His thoughts were a mixture of the day's events, work, frustrations, and things that had been weighing on him. But the calm of the night had a soothing effect, as it always did. But then, just as he began to relax, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. A flash of red and blue lights reflected off the back window of his car, causing him to turn his head slightly. A police cruiser had entered the lot, slowing as it approached. It rolled to a stop a few yards away from him, and through the dim light, Michael could make out the silhouette of the officer in the driver's seat. At first, Michael didn't react. It was common to see patrol cars doing their rounds at night, checking for drunk drivers or other suspicious activity. He had seen this scene before. He had been stopped by cops at gas stations on countless occasions, though not always for the same reasons. His posture remained relaxed as he continued to refuel, unconcerned. He didn't even glance over at the cruiser, not yet. But then, the officer's figure shifted, and Michael knew instinctively that this stop would be different. The cruiser's door swung open with a faint creak, and a young officer stepped out, adjusting his utility belt as he walked toward Michael. The officer's posture was rigid, his hand hovering near his baton as though he expected trouble. Michael let out a slow exhale, his fingers wrapping around the pump handle, sensing the shift in the air. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how these encounters could go. Some police officers seemed to believe their authority could be wielded without question, and in those cases, the situation often escalated quickly. The officer's eyes met his as he closed the distance between them, his gaze narrowing slightly as he stopped just a few feet away from Michael's car. Even "Evening," the officer said, his voice sharp, edged with authority. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Michael, maintaining his calm demeanor, rested his elbow on the roof of his car. He glanced over at the officer, taking in the details, his posture, his aggressive stance, the hand still hovering near his baton. Michael's own stance was easy but firm. He hadn't done anything wrong, he wasn't in a hurry, just getting some gas. That was it. "I'm getting gas," Michael replied, his tone level and controlled, though there was an undertone of questioning. Why the sudden interest? The officer squinted as if he didn't like that answer. "This your vehicle?" He gestured to the sleek sports car, his eyes lingering on it for a moment too long. The judgment was clear, even though he hadn't said it outright. Michael could feel it, the assumption that the car didn't belong here, that somehow he didn't belong here. Michael didn't flinch. He glanced at his car briefly and then back at the officer, his voice unwavering. "Yes, it is." The officer didn't immediately respond, instead taking a small step closer. "I'm going to need to see some ID." At this, Michael's brow furrowed slightly, his expression unchanged. He could tell where this was headed. The officer was trying to get a rise out of him, a small confrontation, a test of dominance. Michael shifted his weight slightly, his hands remaining relaxed by his sides. "Is there a reason for this request?" he asked, keeping his tone measured but firm. He wasn't going to make it easy for the officer to bully him. If this was going to escalate, he wanted to have a clear understanding of why. The officer's jaw tensed, and Michael noticed the shift in his demeanor. The words were coming, he could feel them. The officer leaned in a little closer, his voice lower, more insistent. "You're acting suspicious." Michael tilted his head slightly, studying the officer's face, looking for any signs of uncertainty. "Suspicious? How?" The officer's eyes narrowed further. "You're out here late, dressed all fancy," he said, gesturing to Michael's suit, his polished shoes. "Doesn't fit the area." A quiet laugh escaped Michael's lips, a soft but deliberate sound. He knew what the officer was getting at, and he wasn't going to let the subtle racism slide by unnoticed. "So what exactly would fit the area?" he asked, not backing down but keeping his voice even. The officer's face darkened, his eyes flashing with irritation. He didn't answer immediately, instead shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his hand twitching toward his baton as if he was expecting a confrontation. "You got drugs in the car." The officer's words were clipped sharp. Michael's brow arched at the absurdity of the question. "What?" he replied, disbelief creeping into his voice. The officer's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer, his posture bracing for a reaction. "What's in the trunk?" the officer pressed. He was trying to provoke him, to assert control in a situation where Michael had done nothing wrong. Michael shook his head slowly, his tone unchanging. "You have no probable cause to search my car." For a moment, there was a strange stillness between them. The officer's fingers curled around the baton at his hip, and for a split second, Michael saw something dangerous in the officer's eyes. This wasn't just about making sure everything was in order. This was about power, about testing who was in control. And Michael knew it. He had seen this before, police officers who used their authority as a weapon, forcing their way into situations where they had no right to be. False charges, resisting arrest accusations, things that could be twisted, but not this time, not tonight. Before he could decide what to say next, the officer spoke again, his voice louder, sharper. "Step away from the vehicle." Michael didn't move. The officer took another step forward, and now his baton was fully in his grip. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, as though everything had stopped moving for a moment. Michael stood his ground, his gaze locked on the officer's eyes. "I heard you," the officer spat, his voice trembling slightly with anger. "I said step away from the vehicle." But Michael didn't flinch. He didn't even flinch when the officer raised his baton, brandishing it as a threat. Instead, Michael's voice rang clear, calm, cutting through the silence. "Am I being detained?" he asked, his voice unwavering. The words landed like a hammer, making the officer pause, a moment of hesitation flashing across his face. The officer's grip on the baton tightened slightly, but there was something else now. Something had changed in the atmosphere. The officer's once confident stance faltered for just a second, the arrogance draining from him. It was in that moment, that single question, that the power dynamic began to shift. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The tension between the two men was about to break, and neither of them knew it yet. The air between Michael Davis and Officer Jack Thompson had thickened into something heavier, almost oppressive. Michael stood there, still leaning against the roof of his car, his hands at his sides, trying to maintain a sense of calm despite the obvious unease radiating from the officer before him. The conversation had shifted from what should have been a simple interaction into something more, something loaded with suspicion, a strange kind of judgment that Michael had grown far too familiar with. "You're not from around here," Officer Thompson said, his voice low but cutting through the otherwise quiet night. "This isn't your kind of neighborhood." The words felt like a sharp jab designed to provoke, to plant doubt. Michael's brow furrowed, a frown creeping across his face. He had heard this sort of thing before. It wasn't the first time that someone had made an assumption about him because of where he was or how he dressed, but the way Thompson said it, the way he implied that Michael didn't belong here, struck a nerve. "How do you figure?" Michael asked, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of challenge. He straightened up, no longer leaning against the car but still standing at ease. "What makes you think I don't belong?" The officer looked him up and down, taking in the sharp cut of Michael's tailored navy suit, the polished leather shoes, and the sheen of his car, expensive, sleek, out of place in a neighborhood like this. Michael could see the judgment in the officer's eyes, the way he was categorizing him, trying to place him into a box that didn't fit. There was an invisible line the officer seemed to have drawn between himself and Michael, a line that was marked by wealth, by appearance, by status. And Michael, in his suit and his car, had somehow crossed it. "Fancy clothes, nice car, late at night," the officer continued, shaking his head as if he was putting together a puzzle, one that didn't quite make sense to him. "You don't belong here. People like you don't come to places like this." Michael's jaw tightened. He had heard enough. There it was again, the assumption. He had learned a long time ago that people like Officer Thompson didn't see him for who he was. To them, he wasn't Michael Davis, an accomplished professional, a man who had worked hard to get where he was. To them, he was just another black man in a suit, another person to be suspicious of. But this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. He wasn't going to let the officer paint him into a corner, into a stereotype he didn't fit. He wasn't about to let Thompson's bias dictate the course of this interaction. "I'm just getting gas," Michael replied, his tone still calm but firm as he looked the officer squarely in the eye. "There's no reason for me to not be here. I'm not breaking any laws, and you still haven't given me a valid reason for why I'm being questioned." His voice was measured, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. He wasn't going to back down, not this time. Officer Thompson seemed to bristle at Michael's words, his eyes narrowing as he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He was trying to assert dominance, to make it clear who was in charge. The movement was subtle, but Michael caught it, recognizing the shift in the officer's posture, the way he squared his shoulders and shifted his weight. There was something in the way he stood now, more aggressive, more confrontational. "You're acting suspicious," Thompson said, his voice tinged with authority, though the words themselves didn't make sense. Michael's expression remained unchanged, but he could feel the officer's eyes on him, sizing him up as though trying to figure out what kind of trouble he could cause. There was no justification for the officer's words, no reason why he should be interrogated this way, but Michael knew that the officer wasn't looking for a reason. He was looking for an excuse. "Suspicious," Michael repeated, his voice rising just slightly with incredulity. "What exactly about me is suspicious? I'm standing here getting gas. That's it." The officer's lips twisted into a tight line, his eyes never leaving Michael. "You don't fit the area," he muttered, as though that was all the explanation he needed. Michael shook his head, unable to hide the frustration that bubbled up inside him. "What exactly does that mean? You're telling me I don't belong here just because of what I'm wearing, or because my car's nicer than what you're used to seeing in this part of town? You can't seriously be making assumptions based on that." His voice grew firmer, more direct, but he kept his tone measured, knowing full well that any hint of aggression could escalate things. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes darted briefly to Michael's car, then back to Michael himself. He took a step closer, closing the gap even more. The officer's hand twitched, hovering near his belt where his baton rested. Michael didn't move, standing his ground. He could see the officer's fingers curl slightly around the baton, his grip tightening. "You got something in the car I should know about?" Officer Thompson asked, his voice low and more menacing now. "Drugs, weapons. I'm sure there's a good reason why a guy like you is out here at this hour." Michael's heart rate remained steady as he kept his focus on the officer. The words were ridiculous, the accusations unfounded, but he knew the officer was looking for a reason to escalate the situation. His hand brushed against the nozzle of the fuel pump, but he didn't flinch. He had to keep calm, even if the officer didn't deserve it. "No, officer," Michael said, his voice unwavering. "There's nothing in the car. You don't have probable cause to search it. I haven't broken any laws." The officer's eyes narrowed further, and for a moment, Michael could see the flash of frustration flicker across Thompson's face. The officer wasn't used to being questioned, to being challenged in this way. He had probably expected Michael to be intimidated, to back down in the face of authority. But Michael didn't flinch. He wasn't going to give the officer that satisfaction. For a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a tense standoff, neither willing to give ground. The air between them felt thick with the weight of unspoken words, the officer's growing impatience, and Michael's quiet resolve. He had been in situations like this before. He knew how easily things could spiral out of control if he showed any sign of fear or hesitation. That's when the officer's hand drifted lower, his fingers curling around the grip of his baton, and Michael felt the tension spike. The officer's posture was rigid now, aggressive, and Michael could see that he was ready to escalate the situation further. The slight shift in his stance made it clear that Thompson was about to make a move, whether to search the car, to detain Michael, or worse. Michael had been in enough encounters with law enforcement to recognize when things were about to get physical. But he remained calm. He refused to be baited. "Am I being detained?" Michael asked, his voice unwavering. The question was simple, but it landed with the weight of a hammer, striking the officer at the core. The words hung in the air, as though the question itself had the power to shift the balance. Thompson hesitated. Just for a moment, but Michael noticed it. The officer's grip on the baton tightened, then loosened slightly. His eyes flickered. He wasn't expecting Michael to challenge him so directly. For the first time in the conversation, Officer Thompson paused. He hadn't anticipated this kind of response. He wasn't used to being questioned so directly. His confidence faltered, and Michael saw it, saw the brief flicker of uncertainty in the officer's eyes. Michael took a breath, standing his ground, his posture still relaxed but alert. He wasn't going to let the officer's aggression force him into a corner. Not tonight. Not ever again. The tension that had been building between Michael Davis and Officer Jack Thompson had reached a boiling point. The officer's stance was rigid now, his hand still hovering near his baton, eyes locked onto Michael, waiting for any sign of resistance. Michael stood his ground, his posture calm but alert, his every muscle coiled, prepared for whatever might come next. He could sense that Officer Thompson was searching for a reason to escalate things, to assert his dominance, but Michael wasn't willing to give him that satisfaction. The quiet of the gas station, once interrupted only by the distant hum of passing traffic and the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead, was suddenly broken by a low rumble in the distance. The sound grew louder, the engine noise unmistakable, as though a small convoy was approaching. Michael didn't look over at first. He remained focused on the officer, who was still sizing him up, looking for an excuse to act. Then, from the corner of his eye, Michael noticed something, 3 large, black SUVs with tinted windows slowly cruising into the gas station parking lot. The headlights illuminated the area briefly, casting long, stretching shadows on the pavement before the vehicles came to a stop near the pumps. The hum of the engines died down, but the presence of the SUVs was immediately noticeable, an unmistakable interruption in the already charged atmosphere. Officer Thompson froze. His eyes darted toward the vehicles, narrowing as they came to a halt. The sudden appearance of these sleek, intimidating vehicles, all of them dark and imposing, was out of place in this quiet, forgotten part of town. The officers standing near the cars were clearly well-trained and highly disciplined. Michael could see them even from where he stood, moving with purpose, their body language signaling confidence and control. This wasn't just any random group of people arriving at the station. These were individuals who carried with them a quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. The officer's grip on his baton tightened slightly, and Michael could feel the change in the officer's body language. The initial assumption that Michael was an easy target for intimidation was beginning to shift. Thompson wasn't as confident anymore. The situation had shifted too suddenly, and the officer couldn't ignore the fact that the people emerging from the SUVs were not your typical civilians. One by one, the SUV's doors opened with a soft but deliberate click. First came the unmistakable sound of polished leather shoes meeting the cracked pavement, each step purposeful, measured. They walked with the kind of precision that suggested military training, or at the very least, specialized instruction. The first agent to step out of the vehicle was a tall man, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that contrasted starkly with the faded surroundings of the gas station. His hair was neatly combed back, his expression neutral but intense. He didn't glance at the officer, didn't make eye contact. His focus was entirely on Michael. The agent's movements were fluid, effortless, like someone who had been in high-stress situations before, someone who had learned how to stay calm no matter what. His black sunglasses didn't reflect any light from the dim surroundings, adding to his air of stoicism, but it was the calm way he moved that made Michael realize that something had just shifted. Something important was happening, and Officer Thompson wasn't prepared for it. Following him were 2 other men, both dressed in similarly sharp suits, their appearance equally professional. They were just as meticulous in their movements as the first agent. Each of them wore discreet earpieces, a small but significant detail that marked them as individuals with a certain level of authority. Their focus was unbroken as they positioned themselves near Michael's car, moving with a sense of purpose that made it clear they were not ordinary civilians. These were security professionals. agents of something far more powerful than a local police officer. The agents fanned out, positioning themselves carefully around the area. The gas station attendant, who had been quietly watching the unfolding scene from behind the counter, straightened up at the sight of the new arrivals. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he could tell that, whatever it was serious. The woman who had been standing by the window of the convenience store stepped back, her eyes darting between the officers and the men emerging from the subs. She seemed hesitant, unsure whether to remain or to slip away, but her gaze lingered on the men, drawn by the shift in the air. Officer Thompson's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering between Michael and the agents now surrounding the area. He had no idea who they were or why they were here, but one thing was abundantly clear. The presence of these men had completely altered the balance of power in the situation. The first agent, the one who had emerged from the front SUV, took a few more steps forward, his gaze never leaving Michael. The officer could feel his own confidence wavering as the man drew closer. He wasn't looking at the officer, not even acknowledging his existence. Instead, he walked straight up to Michael, his body language giving off an air of authority and control. Michael stayed silent, but he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He could feel the officer's uncertainty now, how Thompson was growing more uncomfortable by the second. The agent who had approached him finally spoke, his voice low but clear, cutting through the heavy tension in the air. "Are you all right, sir?" The agent asked Michael, completely ignoring Officer Thompson. There was no need for introductions, no need to explain anything. The agent spoke as if this was a routine check, something that happened every day without a second thought. The question wasn't directed at the officer, it was for Michael. And in that moment, it became abundantly clear, the officers now had control, not Thompson. The officer was a bystander, just another person caught in a situation that had spiraled far beyond his reach. Michael, sensing the shift, allowed himself a small but confident smile, his expression remaining calm but sharp. He nodded once, acknowledging the agent's question, and then briefly glanced at the officer, who was standing a few feet away, his eyes wide with confusion. Officer Thompson's posture shifted once more, the rigid stance he had held earlier now faltering, replaced with a slight uncertainty. He wasn't sure who these men were, or why they had arrived, but his gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. The way they moved, the way they positioned themselves, this wasn't just a group of well-dressed individuals who happened to show up. These were professionals, highly trained, and their presence sent a clear message. They weren't here by accident. And their arrival had shifted the balance of power, stripping Thompson of any leverage he might have had. As the agents moved into position, the officer hesitated, his confidence cracking, replaced by a sense of unease that he couldn't ignore. He had gone from the one in control to just another bystander in a matter of seconds. The agent who had spoken to Michael didn't even glance in his direction as he turned his attention to the officer. "Do you have a reason for detaining this man?" The agent's voice was calm but firm, as though he was merely confirming a detail on a checklist. Thompson blinked, the weight of the agent's question hitting him harder than he expected. He had been ready to make his next move, ready to pull Michael into a situation that could easily have turned violent, but now, standing before these men, his earlier bravado seemed misplaced. The officer was no longer in control, no longer calling the shots. The very presence of these agents had taken away any leverage he had. "Well," the agent's question hung in the air, his voice still measured, still professional. The tension between them had completely shifted. The officer's throat tightened, the words stuck in his chest. He tried to speak but found himself unable to come up with anything that made sense, not in front of these men. He had expected an easy situation, an easy stop. But now the consequences of his actions were unfolding right before his eyes, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. The agent remained silent, watching the officer for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned away from Thompson and addressed Michael again, this time with the same calm, confident tone he had used before. "We'll handle this from here," the agent said. "Thank you for your patience." And with that, Officer Thompson was left standing there, a mere spectator in a situation that had spun wildly out of his control. The agents had arrived, and their mere presence had shifted the entire course of the encounter, leaving Thompson to wonder just who he was dealing with. The moment the first agent turned his attention back to Michael, Officer Thompson felt his grip on the situation slip. The agent's composed manner, his unwavering confidence, and the way the other two agents had silently positioned themselves around the scene sent an unmistakable signal. This was no ordinary encounter. Michael wasn't just anyone. These were people who commanded respect, and they had shown up at the exact moment when Officer Thompson thought he had complete control over the situation. The silver-haired agent, who had initially stepped forward with an air of quiet authority, now advanced with a calm precision that made every movement seem deliberate. His dark, well-fitted suit seemed to absorb the night's dim light, giving him an almost otherworldly presence as he walked closer to Michael. His sharp eyes were assessing the situation, but his gaze never faltered as he looked directly at Michael, ignoring Officer Thompson entirely. "Are you okay, sir?" The agent asked Michael, his voice cool and professional, but with an underlying tone of concern that couldn't be missed. There was a quiet authority in his words, the kind that made it clear he wasn't merely a security guard. He was someone who had handled far more intense situations than this, someone who didn't need to assert his dominance with loud commands. Michael, still standing tall and composed, met the agent's gaze without hesitation. He gave a slight nod, appreciating the agent's calm and professional manner. Despite the tension in the air, Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time since the officer had approached him, it felt like the situation was being taken seriously by someone who understood the implications of what was happening. "I'm fine," Michael responded evenly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been through far worse situations and come out unscathed. "Thank you for asking." The agent gave a small nod of acknowledgement but did not turn his gaze from Officer Thompson. The officer, on the other hand, was beginning to feel his stomach tighten. His previous bravado, his belief that he had control over this interaction, was rapidly evaporating. The officer's posture had stiffened as the agent's eyes flicked to him, and the change in the atmosphere was palpable. There was no longer any doubt in Officer Thompson's mind that he was now the one under scrutiny. The silver-haired agent's voice cut through the silence that had enveloped the scene. "Officer Thompson," he began, his tone polite but firm, "I would like to speak with you for a moment." The officer's heart skipped a beat. His name, spoken in such a calm, matter-of-fact tone, felt like a warning. He didn't move at first, unsure of how to respond. The agents hadn't even looked at him like they were concerned with what he had to say. They weren't asking him to explain anything. They were simply issuing orders, taking control, and it felt like a cold slap across his face. Taking a slow breath, Officer Thompson swallowed hard, trying to regain some semblance of control over himself. He shifted his stance slightly but remained silent, hoping the moment of discomfort would pass. But it didn't. Instead, the agent's calm words continued to ring in his ears, louder now. "You are detaining this man without cause. I need you to stop immediately." The words were delivered with a precise sharpness that left no room for argument. The agent didn't raise his voice, didn't make any unnecessary gestures. He simply stated the facts. Michael Davis is a high-ranking government official, and your actions here are unjustified. At that moment, Officer Thompson felt his world shift. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His mouth went dry, his throat tight, and his chest constricted as the weight of the agent's words settled over him. Michael Davis wasn't just a man at a gas station. He wasn't just some well-dressed black man in an expensive car who had caught the officer's attention because he didn't fit the officer's narrow perception of who belonged in that neighborhood. No, Michael Davis was someone powerful, someone whose presence here was far more significant than Officer Thompson had realized. The officer's mind raced. A government official. But why hadn't he recognized him? He tried to backtrack, to justify his actions in his mind. Michael had been a target. He had been out of place, hadn't he? The officer's own bias had driven his assumptions, and now, facing the reality of his mistake, he felt a sense of dread begin to creep into his bones. I didn't know, Thompson stammered, his voice faltering for the first time. He quickly tried to recover, but the words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of the agent's cold gaze. His face flushed with heat, the blood rushing to his head as his nerves finally caught up with him. I was just doing my job. Just making sure everything was in order. The silver-haired agent didn't react immediately. He didn't even acknowledge the officer's words. Instead, he took another deliberate step toward Thompson, his posture unwavering and his gaze never leaving the officer. Your job, the agent said slowly, is to protect and serve, to uphold the law, but what you've done here, Officer Thompson, goes beyond your responsibilities. You've overstepped, and now you will be held accountable for it. There it was again, the authority in the agent's voice, the calm confidence that made it clear he was no longer asking for an explanation. The agent was not interested in the officer's excuses, in his explanation. He wasn't here to listen to him. He was here to make sure that Michael Davis was treated with the respect and dignity he deserved, and that Officer Thompson understood the consequences of his actions. Michael, standing to the side, observed quietly as the agent continued to speak with Thompson, the officer now visibly shrinking under the weight of the agent's presence. The sense of power had shifted completely. Michael's heart rate slowed, his grip on the situation now more secure than ever, but he couldn't help but feel a slight twinge of satisfaction at watching the officer squirm. It wasn't about power. It was about accountability, about the realization that not everyone was as easy to intimidate as the officer might have assumed. Thompson's gaze shifted downward as the agent spoke, unable to meet the agent's eyes. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. He had made a mistake, a big one, and there was no way out of it. His authority had been questioned, exposed for what it was, a false sense of power that had been built on assumptions and biases, not the law. The agent's words were measured, deliberate, and each one seemed to cut through the officer's nervous deflections like a blade. I'll be reporting this incident, the agent continued, his voice unwavering. And I strongly suggest you reconsider how you handle situations like this in the future. As for Mr. Davis, I'm sure you're aware that his status demands a level of respect, something you failed to extend. At this, Officer Thompson's shoulders slumped, the weight of his mistake too much to bear. His chest tightened, and he could feel the beads of sweat gathering at the back of his neck, despite the coolness of the night. He wanted to speak, to justify his actions, but he couldn't find the words. Michael, watching the exchange from a safe distance, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. The officer had tried to make this an issue of power, to try and force a narrative where Michael was in the wrong. But the shift had come swiftly and decisively. The power dynamic was no longer in the officer's favor. It was in Michael's hands now, and it was clear that Officer Thompson was beginning to realize just how out of his depth he had become. I didn't know," Thompson repeated, his voice almost pleading now. The remorse was palpable in his voice, but it was too late for apologies. The agent didn't respond. He simply took one last glance at Thompson, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Next time, I suggest you ask the right questions before making assumptions about someone's identity," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen enough to know when it was time to end the conversation. The agent turned back to Michael, his attention now fully on him. "Mr. Davis, I'm sorry for this inconvenience. You are free to go." Michael nodded in acknowledgement, his expression still calm but now tinged with a quiet sense of victory. He had navigated this ordeal without raising his voice, without letting fear dictate his actions. And now, with the agent's presence, the officer was left to face the consequences of his own actions. Officer Thompson, standing silently at the edge of the scene, watched as the agents walked away, leaving him behind in the quiet night. The weight of his mistake settled over him like a heavy blanket, and he knew, deep down, that he would never forget this moment. But for Michael, it was just another victory, one in a long line of countless moments where power had shifted in his favor, not because of who he was, but because of who he refused to let others think he was. As the silver-haired agent turned his back to Officer Thompson, his focus returned fully to Michael Davis. Michael's posture had never wavered throughout the entire exchange. He remained calm, collected, and poised. Despite the chaotic turn of events, the tension that had filled the air was now dissipating, replaced by a stillness that hung between him and the officer. Michael knew that the time had come for him to leave the scene, to take control of the situation in a way that reflected his strength, not through aggression or anger, but through his quiet resolve. He glanced over at Officer Thompson, who was standing at a distance, his body stiff, his eyes wide with realization. The officer's earlier bravado had crumbled. There was nothing left to say. No more justifications, no excuses that could cover up the mistakes he had made. The damage had been done. Michael's voice broke the silence, soft yet resolute. "Officer Thompson," he began, his tone steady, "I don't want to escalate this further, but I want you to understand this. You've treated me unfairly. That's all I'm going to say." He didn't raise his voice. There was no need for that. His words were simply a statement of fact. Michael wasn't angry, but he was clear. There was no room for confusion, no space for ambiguity in the way he was treated. The officer, still standing there with his shoulders slumped, felt the weight of Michael's words more profoundly than any reprimand could convey. Michael didn't have to shout or threaten him. He had made his point without raising his voice, without making a scene. His calmness was more powerful than any show of force could have been. In that moment, Officer Thompson knew there was nothing left to do but accept the truth. Michael didn't wait for a response. He wasn't there to make the officer feel comfortable with his actions. He was there to make a point, and he had done so effectively. Without another word, Michael turned toward his car, his hand resting lightly on the door handle. The sleek black sports car, which had been at the center of so much attention moments before, now felt like the embodiment of calm, something that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the situation. As Michael slid into the driver's seat, he spared one last glance at Officer Thompson. The officer's face was a mixture of confusion, regret, and shame. His eyes had followed Michael's every move, but there was no defiance in them now, only the realization that he had crossed a line, one he could never uncross. There would be no taking back the assumptions he had made, no erasing the fact that he had abused his power, No reversing the chain of events that had played out in those tense moments. The engine of Michael's car purred to life, and with a smooth, controlled motion, he pulled away from the pump, gliding out of the parking lot. The bright headlights of the vehicle sliced through the darkness, illuminating the quiet road ahead. The sound of the engine, once a soft hum, now echoed in the stillness of the night, marking his departure from the scene. Officer Thompson stood motionless, his feet rooted to the ground, his gaze fixed on the taillights of the car as it disappeared into the distance. The world around him had returned to normal. The gas station was once again just a quiet, desolate place, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Thompson could feel the pressure building in his chest, the shame gnawing at him. The quiet he had once found comforting now felt suffocating. The officers who had arrived, those silent figures in their dark suits, had already disappeared. They had done what they came to do, and now their presence was no longer necessary. The situation had been diffused, but the officer was left standing there with nothing to do but reflect. His thoughts raced. He thought about his initial approach to Michael, about the assumptions he had made based solely on appearance, about how his own biases had influenced his actions. How many times had he made snap judgments about people, only to find out later that he was wrong? But this time, the consequences were greater. This time, it wasn't just a small mistake. It wasn't just a minor embarrassment. He had overstepped, and now he was left to grapple with the reality of that overstep. Officer Thompson had allowed his own biases to guide his actions. He had allowed himself to believe that his authority was enough to control any situation, even when he had no justification for it. He had allowed his assumptions about Michael, based on nothing more than his appearance, to cloud his judgment. And now, standing in the aftermath, he understood the full weight of his actions. It wasn't just about the embarrassment he felt in that moment. It wasn't just about his pride being bruised. It was about the realization that he had been part of a much larger, much more damaging system, one that allowed people like Michael to be treated unfairly simply because of how they looked, because of the color of their skin, or the clothes they wore. Officer Thompson realized, with a clarity he had never experienced before, how deeply ingrained these biases were in the system he was a part of. As Michael's car disappeared into the night, Officer Thompson stood alone, grappling with the enormity of what had just occurred. The world had shifted around him, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the truth. His actions had been fueled by prejudice, by an unjust system that had allowed him to wield power without questioning the consequences. But now, that power had slipped away, exposed for what it truly was. Michael's calm departure was the final lesson in a night that had changed the course of an interaction, but more than that, it had shifted the power dynamic entirely. Michael hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to get angry. He had simply stood firm in his rights, and the arrival of the agents had turned the tables, showing Officer Thompson that power could come from places he hadn't expected. As Michael's car faded from view, Officer Thompson's thoughts turned inward. He knew that he would carry the weight of this moment with him, and that it would follow him long after the night had ended. But more than that, he realized that this moment, this very realization, was the beginning of something he couldn't ignore. It was the beginning of him questioning everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and fairness. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a cop and a man at a gas station. It was a story about how power can be abused when it is left unchecked, how assumptions can be dangerous, and how standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the truth is the most powerful thing anyone can do. Michael's calm and quiet refusal to be intimidated had made that clear. Justice wasn't about loud defiance or confrontation. Sometimes, It was about simply refusing to be treated unfairly, no matter who was on the other side. And as Officer Thompson watched the last traces of Michael's taillights fade into the horizon, he knew that things would never be the same for him again. The lesson had been delivered. Now, he would have to live with it.